You are listening to Seeking the Hidden Thing with Kryptos. Welcome, everyone, to another episode of Seeking the Hidden Thing podcast. I'm really excited about today's podcast. It's going to begin a series. I kind of cajoled and bullied Athenian into doing this with me. But we are going to deep dive. Yeah, we are going to deep dive into Hans-Georg Gadamer's Truth and Method. And the more that Athenian and I have been messaging back and forth, the more excited the both of us have been getting to bring this to you. We have no idea how long this is going to stretch out, but we have both immensely enjoyed, getting back into Gadamer again, and then just realizing anew for ourselves just how important this text is. So, welcome, Athenian, and I'm really excited to be doing this.
Yeah, thanks so much for including me in this, because it has so many deep connections to a number of the projects that I'm doing with regard to, for instance, things like the rise of the modern university, the discussion of the reception of philosophy in America, which is to say, in many respects, the transformation of Christianity in America. But all of this is so incredibly important because it touches on so much that, what we have here is really, we're at the level of the foundations, fundamentals right here, which is to say the things that most people don't realize are even questionable. And so what's going to come tumbling out from this series of discussions about Gadamer, and particularly Truth and Method, is going to be, hopefully, for your listeners, very eye-opening, because it's going to reveal a world of depth, both with respect to philosophy, but also with respect to biblical interpretation, that they might not even know really exists, or just have a sort of a faint glimmer of it. But yeah, this is big. Yeah.
It's also one of those things too, where once you begin to get into the problems and you begin to work through them, it's not just merely biblical interpretation, but the problems that Gadamer lays out for us are, in a sense, even underlying this is the question of how can any man have a spiritual life in the modern era. And what Gadamer is going to do. In many ways, I think, just to boil it down, the project that Gadamer is on is, to put it sort of simply, is the rehabilitation of the idea of intuition as the core foundation of truth, as opposed to method. And and I think that's really kind of, at least as far as I see it. And that sort of gives us then as the question of like, well, how do you gain the meaning of Scripture? How do you interpret Scripture? But maybe a deeper question is, how do you intuit the reality of God? And that, in a sense, lays the foundation, because Gadamer will give you the tools, in a sense, philosophically, that will, in my eyes anyways, and this is kind of why it was so important to me, that will then bolster your engagement in the spiritual life.
Yeah, let me clarify something too, just to sort of emphasize for your listeners to be aware of. That word, intuition, is everything. In German, it's Anschauung. And what this means is that, as we're going to see, and what Gadamer, the reason Gadamer is so important is because what Anschauung, or intuition, is a kind of insight into things, and so it grounds what it means to even know something, right? So what we are, when I mentioned earlier that we're at the level of foundations. What's going on in all of this is, what does it even mean to know? Now, what we're going to find out, and this is the thing with Gadamer, and particularly in Truth and Method. What has happened in the West is that we have a kind of bottlenecking of new knowledge, and the way that shows itself, particularly beginning with, really this sort of, starts with Hegel in a sense, but leading up especially to almost every 20th century thinker, is that you have to have read an enormous amount to even know, to even be able to read these people. So for instance, Gadamer is going to go provide us, he's going to be doing philosophy while also giving us a history of philosophy. And so he's going to list and be engaged in a discussion with a number of just absolutely definitive thinkers from the 18th and the 19th century that most people have never even heard of. And so then the question is, well, how do you understand Gadamer if you haven't read these people? Well, see, that's the issue, is that Gadamer is speaking to what he thinks are the educated elite. It's like I'm speaking, in other words, what Gadamer is saying is, in order to be even engaged in a conversation with me, you need to have a base sort of familiarity with these people, because his history of them is itself going to be what causes a lot of criticism from contemporaries, because Gadamer in many ways is dismissed today for a number of reasons that are themselves very questionable. Gadamer, for instance, is engaged in a defense of tradition. Now, if you as an academic are certainly involved in higher education, are going to be talking about someone who's defending tradition, they're just going to sort of laugh at you, because no one wants to defend tradition. They say, oh, that's old stuff, right? No one really believes in that anymore, right? Everything is new. Everything is not only new, it's post-new, right? So it's not even modern, it's post-modern. We're past all those things, right? And so that's what Gadamer is engaged in. But it's that fundamental level there of what it even means to know that is so crucial for Gadamer. And in fact, the entire tradition of philosophy, beginning at least with the 18th century, all over Europe. And so the way that shows itself with Gadamer, well, with all of them really, and I mean really all of them, is how do we even know how to read a book, right? What does reading even mean? What does it mean to say that you have a knowledge or an interpretation that is veridical, right? A true interpretation of a text. Well, that's the whole point of what Gadamer is at with this notion of hermeneutics and in the notion of interpretation, because it's more than just being able to interpret a text. For all of these thinkers, it's how do you interpret anything in the world, most especially, for instance, science, these kinds of things. And so again, what most people take for granted is that, well, it's the science says. Well, hold on a second. Is it the case that science is a very particular kind of interpretation of the phenomena that we're looking at? And that's going to get us into what Gadamer begins with as far as Kant, right? Phenomena and noumena. But I just wanted to sort of clarify that for your listeners to understand why this is so crucial, is because knowing what it means to even know as it shows itself, and knowing how to read a book, or knowing how to interpret the world around us, that is ground zero. And that is exactly what Gadamer is wrestling with throughout the entirety of his works, for us as a people, right? As a culture, et cetera, all these kinds of things. In fact, culture is going to be definitive for what Gadamer is looking into here. What do we even mean by culture, tradition, et cetera?
Exactly. And the thing is, like for the listener, there is really sort of two post worlds when we talk about philosophy. One is like the post Nietzschean world, where, the marking of the question of, God is dead, right? And we killed him kind of thing. So you live in the post Nietzschean world, But there's also another post-world, which is post-Kantian. And Kant sort of sets up Nietzsche in that sense of like, once you begin with Kant, Nietzsche is sort of in many ways the logical conclusion of the road that begins with Kant. And with Kant, you're looking for the sure foundation of knowledge. That's kind of the quest. How can I find sure knowledge? And in looking for sure knowledge, he rejects intuition. And now I'm no Kantian, but intuition is rejected in favor of, what we would later come, empiricism. So reason and that which can be observed. So if you can make a rational argument with words, language, and you can observe phenomena, measure them, weigh them, calculate them, those then become things that you can know for certain. Whereas anything that you must be grasped with intuition is uncertain knowledge, and your connection to it is at best dubious. And this is sort of where he says it's a priori. You just assume your connection to these things that you're intuiting, but you can't actually establish them with reason or observation. And so you're cut off from this whole realm of the intuitive. And from there, then you have to then, grapple now with the problem of knowledge. And the way that Gadamer ends up approaching it is not by challenging the idea of science head on, but by arguing that methodological knowing in terms of observation and reason, this kind of methodological knowing, is subject to the same problems that intuitive knowing is. And that's the way he kind of comes around to it, is that when you begin to, and that's why when he starts at the beginning, he begins with John Stuart Mill's sort of inductive logic of the sort of, that basically begins with John Stuart Mill and, inductive reasoning and sort of the basis of the foundation of what we know now as scientific knowledge. And what he argues there at the very beginning is that the very idea of objective knowledge, he says, almost by definition, separates you from the thing that you're knowing, because you're looking at it as object, as other. So he says even the scientist has absolutely no connection with the thing that he's knowing. And so all he's doing is merely observing phenomena, but he isn't actually knowing anything. So and now these observations, granted, have given humanity great power to manipulate the world, and nobody is denying this. But in the cost for this kind of methodological, objective approach to knowing means that you have cut yourself off from any actual real knowledge of anything. You're just observing phenomenon, but you don't know anything. And this observation of phenomenon was grasped a hold of because it has tremendous power. And, and so in this grasping for, effective power, the thing that you then cut yourself off from is actually knowing anything at all, which is kind of bizarre. People think like, oh, we know all kinds of things, right? Well, and that's the problem, is that it creates the illusion, the simulacrum of knowledge without its reality. And then so Gadamer begins from there to begin to kind of explain to you in a sense of what knowledge is. And he approaches it through aesthetics, because aesthetics is sort of one of the areas that Kant has some problems with. And it's also an area that's free from content, in the same sense that we would think of like scientific content or even the rational content of words, is that then freed from the problem of correct interpretation or scientific measurement, that you can then now approach the problem of knowledge of how do you know things without having to necessarily worry about the content of that knowledge.
Yeah, let me. So this is what's so fascinating about Gadamer, and this gets us to the very title, right? Readers should always ask themselves, okay, why has this author that I'm reading titled his book this way? So truth and method. What Gadamer is concerned with is how it is that this thing called truth is related to the methodological approach to gaining access of truth. And why he is going to begin with a long and detailed discussion of Kant. Well, I mean, it actually goes back further. He's gonna have quite a bit to say about, for instance, Francis Bacon, and as you had just mentioned, there, Kryptos, John Stuart Mill, etc. Is that what has happened is that in opposition to this thing we call Anschauung, right, intuition of things, what has happened is that this approach to truth has turned into this attempt to understand the phenomena of the world. In other words, for instance, empiricism that you find with Locke. It's just everywhere. I mean, people might be familiar with the so-called empiricists, right? We're talking about Francis Bacon, right? With experimental approach to things like that, and John Locke, and a number of other English thinkers, and so the issue is that we encounter things outside of ourselves, and in our minds, those things are so that they are represented, right? This is going to be everything for Kant. This is the notion of Vorstellung, which is to say the representation of a thing, right? So the question is, how do we understand the representation of the thing outside of ourselves, inside of ourselves? And ultimately, what's going to happen in the German tradition, really beginning with Leibniz, but Kant is building on this, is that we no longer have access to our inner selves in the sense of the kind of Anschauung, the insight. That's going to be simply labeled as spontaneity. It just occurs. We have no access to it, so we don't know how we get there. And what this is going to lead ultimately to is this radical separation of our inside or inner workings of the mind and the outer workings that we experience of the world. And that's what Kant is going to be fundamentally concerned with. He's going to refer to the objects outside of ourselves as the phenomenal realm, and he's going to refer to the things inside of us as the noumenal realm. Now, he chooses these words very specifically because phenomena, the phenai, in Greek means appearance, the appearance of things, whereas the Greek for knowledge, the kind of perceptual insight, is nous. So the inner working of the mind, the noumena, versus the things that we experience from the outside world, phenomena. And we have access to these things only by how they are represented by way of sense perception. And so Kant is fundamentally concerned with what is the process of this representation or representing of the things outside of us, inside of us. And this gets to the heart of Kant's enterprise, which Gadamer is fundamentally concerned with. We have three critiques from Kant. You have the critique of pure reason. That's the first. We're talking roughly 1781, first edition. Second edition, 1788. Then you have the critique of practical reason. Okay, so the critique of pure reason is fundamentally concerned with nature, right? The workings, or we could say, of science, grounding those things. And then the critique of practical reason is concerned with, as it's sort of in the name, practical reason. In other words, how we live our lives, right? So he's fundamentally concerned with morality, which is to say the realm of freedom. So you have the realm of nature in the critique of pure reason. Then you have the realm of freedom or morality with the critique of practical reason. Now, for Kant, this leads directly to the third critique, which is by far, we could say, the most complicated one, which is the critique of the power of judgment. This concerns two things: purposiveness, or we could even say teleology, Kant's going to refer to it, but really he means more like a purposiveness, and what's most important, the kinds of judgments that are most important for us as humans, judgments about the beautiful and the sublime. Mm-hmm. And it's going to be that the realm of, and that's, so we're in the realm of aesthetics. Mm-hmm. It's going to be that third critique, which is to say, on the one hand, you have evaluations of science, we could say, in the first critique, and then you have evaluations or judgments of morality in the second critique. Now, the question for Kant is, how do we bring those two things together? Because Kant's always saying we want apodictic certainty. Now, again, he's tinkering with the Greek, in other words, to get away from apori, which is to say things that are they're fundamentally stopped, right? It's like, okay, we can't get past this, right? That they're aporetic. So he wants to know with absolute certainty things that we evaluate or judge in science. First critique, second critique, the kind of certainty we can have in morality. In other words, evaluations or judgments of what is right and what is wrong. And then he wants to be able to find a way to bridge these two things together, because that's what this question, what is man? Well, man is going to be the combination of these two realms, which seem to be rather incredibly separate. They require two separate texts. And the way that Kant bridges that gap, in other words, to establish man as such, is to say what unites these two things is the notion of purposiveness with regard to, most especially, aesthetics, beauty. And so what he has in mind here is that this gets back around to these other discussions that we've had, so the listeners can sort of see the unity of all these things coming together. The issue is objectivity. In other words, now think about that. Objective, in other words, it is characterized by some kind of object, and then the ivity, right? It makes it a noun. So Kant is concerned with thinking in terms of representations of objects, and the way that he establishes this, and this is what most people fail to understand about objectivity, the whole of the first critique is about this. And Kant's going to refer to this as his so-called Copernican revolution. Previously, with Descartes, for instance, in the rationalist tradition, the certain knowledge occurs from being rooted in oneself. What Kant is going to do is he's going to invert that and say, well, we only are able to get a sort of grounding for the self by way of objects outside of ourselves, right? They're going to help us establish that. So objectivity for Kant is thoroughly defined by the inner subjectivity of the thinker. Now, this is where Gadamer comes in, because what Kant is going to argue in the third critique is that aesthetics helps us with this most especially because the thinker, man, takes great delight in knowing that his experience with the aesthetical, with beauty, etc., is fundamentally in harmony with the objective reality outside of himself. And so it's not a kind of subjectivism that is, just based on whatever one feels. That's not at all. In fact, I could even read the passages where Kant says, look, Kant's going to talk about taste, and Gadamer is going to have a lot to say about this. Kant
Yes.
is going to say very specifically in the Critique of Judgment, and he has entire chapters labeled this, is that taste is not a matter of feeling. In fact, feeling is the problem. Like that. No, what Kant is saying is that taste or one's pleasure of the aesthetic is fundamentally represented uh, by the way in which the outer world, the objective knowledge of the outer world, is united with the conditions of knowing within the self. But it is very easy to slip into a kind of subjectivity, right? If one doesn't read Kant very carefully, then one's going to think, oh, well, this is just radical subjectivism. Now, Gadamer is absolutely aware of that, and he knows that that's not what Kant is saying, but he's fully aware of how it has turned out in the tradition that
Mm-hmm.
from Kant we end up getting to, for instance, something like a Nietzsche. So, for instance, this is what Kant. So, in 1781, Kant actually says this in the Critique of Pure Reason, the first critique. He says it sounds arrogant, self-seeking, and for those who have not yet relinquished their old system, belittling to assert. Now, this is what Kant is asserting, that prior to the development of critical philosophy, in other words, Kant's philosophy, there had been no philosophy at all. So, no philosophy at all prior to Kant. Then Hegel, interestingly, and this is going to be someone who Gadamer is fundamentally influenced by. And what people don't understand about Hegel is that Hegel represents the synthesizing of pre-modernity with modernity itself. So Hegel is the great synthesizer that says, no, these things they belong together. Modernity grows out of and perfects pre-modernity. What Hegel says, this is hilarious. This is only about, I think, 20 or so years later, is he's going to say that in the conclusion of his lectures on the philosophy of world history, he says, with this, history of philosophy comes to an end. So no philosophy existed prior to 1781, according to Kant. And then 25 years later, Hegel says philosophy is done. It's concluded. So 25 years. In the span of 25 years, everything has been completed. Now, fast forward to almost 100 years later, but not quite. This is what Nietzsche says, and this is going to be extremely important for understanding the kind of criticisms that are leveled at Gadamer, because Gadamer is going to emphasize fundamentally the role of interpretation, hermeneutics. This is what Nietzsche says. He says, against positivism, so Nietzsche's talking about positivism, in other words, science, which halts at all phenomena. There's that word phenomena again. And Nietzsche uses this as the spokesman for positivism. He says there are only facts, right? Only facts, right? This is science, right? Just the facts. And what Nietzsche says is, he says no. He says facts is precisely what there is not. He says facts are only interpretations. And then he speaks again and says everything is subjective. You will say, this is Nietzsche. He says, but even this is interpretation. So Nietzsche is saying that. So what you have with Nietzsche is that everything is radically subjective. He's going to say in this same passage from about 1888 that he's going to announce perspectivism. Right. This is Nietzsche's claim to understanding the phenomena, is that everything is just a matter of perspective. You have your truth, others have their truth. There's no such thing as truth. It's simply a matter of how you look at things. In other words, how you interpret things. Gadamer is fighting against all of this because he's saying, look, there is truth to what's going on with Kant and Hegel in particular. But what has happened is it has spiraled out of control into radical subjectivism, which is to say nihilism. And Heidegger and Gadamer are saying, no, we have to push against that, and here's how. And so that's going to be Heidegger. Well, I keep saying Heidegger because I want to say something about the way in which Gadamer is so fundamentally influenced by Heidegger, but only in his early and his later phases. But what Gadamer is so concerned with is defending tradition by means of this deeply, deeply philosophical understanding of what interpretation even means. So that's essentially, we could say, the background, because what happens from Hegel all the way through to Nietzsche, that's when you're going to get all these various biblical interpretations, because so very much of all this arose out of the rise of, well, interpreting the Bible. So you have all these various thinkers like Schleiermacher, Semler, and a number of other people. Now, and it's all going to hinge on this question of history, which for Gadamer, well, he's right. History is the newest thing under the sun, and what needs to be reckoned with. So,
well, yeah, and the thing is that the defense of tradition is not tradition in the past as an old thing that's way back there, but Gadamer is defending the possibility of a living tradition, something that has been carried forward from the past and still lives today as a thing that informs present life, and not in a sense where you have to overcome a bridge between here and there, like something that where there's like a severed reality. You don't know the language, but tradition is something that is actually experienced in the here and now. And you know, the one of the problems that he's fighting against too as well is, you know, methodological interpretation. So what we would call like the new criticism, basically the way that everybody's taught to read the Bible today. So we're taught to read the Bible scientifically. And so we treat the scripture like it's an object that then must be exhumed. And we dive in and we use all of the tools of, you know, philology, form criticism, historical criticism. And we don't call it these things necessarily, but that's what we're doing. What we tell ourselves is that we're doing sound research, but we're basically doing a scientific examination of the Bible. And we're looking at it, you know, the Wissenschaft, you know, it's what is it? Geisteswissenschaft, you know, like the science of history in that sense, and or the science of the spirit, culture. And so and I think to maybe frame sort of the transition and what Kant is grappling. And we can look at the historical realities. I know like an author like Walter Ahn talks about the importance of, say, the printing press and the prevalence of the printed word and the psychological changes that it affects in especially the intellectual classes and how they think differently prior to, you know, in a post-printed printed word world than prior to that. But prior to Kant, there was the older understanding, the integration of that the inner and outer experience was not bifurcated anyway. So in a sense, your apprehension of things was unself-conscious in a sense, that you met God in things and you didn't question or think about it. You just met God in things. And we as moderns really can't relate to that because Kant rightly identifies that for us, the world has become object. It's an other. And one of the things, and I was just pointing this out to Athenian this morning, one of the things that Gadamer notes is in this transition where everything becomes other, it lays the groundwork for what we now know as mass culture, right? So we think of mass culture as these big, you know, mass groups, but mass culture is built around making everyone an individual. And so what happens is that as the subject object split is like what Athenian was talking about, you know, it begins with Descartes, you know, well, the only thing I can trust is my own reason. And then out from my own reason, then I can connect with the world around you. And Kant just says, no, you know, in a sense, only thing is like reason and method sort of bring the world back into you in terms of representations, but you're not actually encountering the thing itself. You're just like you're bringing in these representations, and then from Kant, Schiller and others, they radically subjectivize this, and up until you get to Nietzsche. But the sociological process that happens alongside of this is that we become increasingly alienated from each other. So just as you begin to look at the world scientifically, everything as object and objective knowledge, you also then to begin to relate to each other as object, and you relate to everything as object. And so this breakdown in truth also coincides with a breakdown in society. And so Gadamer will ask the question later, kind of what holds everything together? Well, what ends up holding everything together ultimately is propaganda, right? Your world is reconstructed for you by the propagandist. And so this is in a sense of what really Gadamer is grappling with is fundamentally, in a sense, the question of modernity. Is in a sense, how do we have community even? Not just even how do we understand texts, but how do we even connect with other human beings? Like, what is the process of just understanding another person, building community? And in this world where there's this radical subject-object split, where everything is objectified and everything is made into objective knowledge, you can't know anyone, not even other people. Like that makes community in a sense impossible. The whole notion of methodological scientific knowledge undermines the foundation of community. Like he says, like this is page 7, right, where he's talking about the sort of the object turning, like in this case, turning history into an object. The antithesis shows that for Dilthey, scientific knowledge obliges one to sever one's bond with life, to attain distance from one's own history, which alone makes it possible that history becomes an object. And when you realize what Dilthey is saying there, and what Gadamer is saying about Dilthey, is that in order to examine anything like scientifically, you must first of all make it into an object. You must sever yourself from the thing that you're observing. And then you go into the Kantian thing where now that you've severed yourself from it, all you've got are representations, just sensory objects. You don't know the thing itself at all. So when you do psychology, you do sociology, you do historically, and this is the thing about the scriptures. So if you begin to examine the scriptures scientifically, using the tools of science to understand the Bible, what you end up doing is cutting yourself off from scripture. You have and this is what Gadamer, in a sense, you have a simulacrum of knowledge, but you don't actually know the thing itself. So you in a sense gain mastery and power over the world, over the word of God. In a sense, it allows you to do things like systematic theology. You can now systematize it, turn it into, just like the scientist does, into a system of knowledge. You've gained mastery over the scriptures. You now have, you can give theological precision to every idea that's in there. You've gained mastery over it, but it still fundamentally remains an object. It is separate from you. It's another. You don't know the thing itself. And that's, I think, this is really something that's, I think, opaque to us as moderns, that we think that we know things as science, and it gives us the appearance of knowledge, the simulacrum of knowledge, without real actual knowledge. And what Gadamer is saying is that you don't understand anything because you don't understand what understanding is. And that's where he ends up going, and that's the term, at least in English, that we know, is that what we're looking for in this is, how do we understand anything? A text, people, the natural world, art, science, anything. How do we understand? And so how do we rebuild this connection to the other? And thus establish knowledge of the other, and not just the appearance of knowledge of the other.
Yeah. So just a few points. And again, this is what makes Gadamer so helpful for us today. So understanding, the German there is verstehen. What you have with Kant, and continuing all the way up until today, is that understanding, verstehen, is it is something that is not reason, Vernunft, right? Reason for Kant is going to be very, very specific. He's going to the ideas of reason is what Kant introduces, and he's going to say that this is
The
his
concept.
Well, he's going to say that this is the proper understanding of Plato's ideas, and so there are three ideas of reason. Now he's going to expand that to four later in the anthropology, but what Kant is saying is that any question you ask, any question, if you pursue it far enough, it will lead you to only one of these three or four ideas of reason. But what does it mean to pursue them? Well, that's going to be the rise of Verstehen, understanding. And that's what is so crucial. That's the understanding is the inner life of the subject, the ego, right? That's how we get to this notion of veridic, in other words, true judgments about things that we perceive, because they become they're correlated properly with the ideas of reason. Now, these ideas of reason, I guess I should clarify them. They all come back to these fundamental questions. What is the status of God? What is the status of freedom? And what is the status of the immortality of the soul? Those are the three things. Now, what's going to happen is that he's going to say we can't ever get to certain knowledge about any of them except maybe freedom. That's going to be Kant's emphasis on morality. But what Gadamer, and you brought up Dilthey, so what Dilthey emphasizes in his approach, and again, this is someone that most people don't even know his name. I mean, I went through an entire undergraduate education in philosophy, and I never encountered Dilthey, Schleiermacher, Schiller, none of these people that are so crucial along the way. It wasn't until much later and almost at the end of my graduate school. I mean, we're talking almost at the postdoctoral level of PhD that these things were made aware to me, and then I had to pursue them all on my own. But this question of worldview. Now, the German there's Weltanschauung, right? Now, there's that Anschauung, right? And Welt just means world. Dilthey is going to be the one who's going to emphasize this notion of a worldview. And what Gadamer points out is he says, look, the first person who ever uses this word is Hegel. And he tells us exactly where in Hegel's Phenomenology of Spirit. And now let's also think about that word world. So worldview ultimately is going to be, in its most basic level, no different than Nietzsche's perspectivism, right? Everything is just a matter. Your understanding of the world is just from your view of the world, right? That's the radical subjectivism that Gadamer is wanting to go against. And the issue there the issue for all of this is the notion of world. What is a world? Most people are not familiar that this word world is very new under the sun. The Greeks don't even have a word for it. Because there was no, I mean, what do you mean a world? I mean, it's the phenomenal whole around us, right? The collection of all the phenomena, the appearances around us. What Kant does, and this becomes more and more and more explicit and definitive of the notion of subjectivity after Kant. What Gadamer is trying to guard against is everything becomes world construction. You construct a world. Now, the significance of this for us is that many people probably hear the word social construct. It's just a social construct. This is going to be what most people define culture as. is they say, well, it's just a social construct, justice, all that, it's all just social construct. They have no clue that that phrase, social construct, is very new. It originated in 1960 with some sociologists in America. That's how new it is. And yet people say it now as if it is absolute certain, like it's just a social construct, man. And so this notion of world construction is what's going to be greatly, greatly at issue. And so how do you construct the world with this newest thing under the sun that is so important? History. So in other words, our consciousness, and this is why Gadamer is emphasizing back to Hegel, our consciousness is going to be fundamentally conditioned by history. Hegel's famous claim is that no man can stand outside of his own time. Well, okay, what does that mean, especially for Christians? In other words, how do we relate to what we're given as divine revelation according to the Bible? How can you actually properly interpret or read the book of Genesis or any of the Gospels, right? I mean, because what the claim is going to be is that any kind of human consciousness that is not historical consciousness is going to be fundamentally a lower level of human consciousness, right? So this is the discovery, we could say, of history and how it is so pervasive. This you get these claims all the time. People say, well, I'm not going to read Aristotle because look, they had slaves in his time, so obviously he wasn't on the right side of history. They say it about the American founders. They say the American founders could not have possibly imagined the technology we have, and plus, by the way, they own slaves, so we don't need them. They're outdated. And so what Gadamer is fundamentally concerned with in all of this discussion with history is how it is that we are able to, and this defines tradition, how it is that we are able to even enter into a serious understanding, right? There's that word again, verstehen, of our predecessors. In other words, how do we, this is the so-called question, the hermeneutical circle. The hermeneutical circle is, how do I enter into a text if it is written by people who are fundamentally not within my history, my era, my time? So you have to be able to navigate. If you are so defined by a kind of tradition or a history, you have to be able to navigate back into, for instance, the origin of that history. But the claim that's going to be made by so many what are called historicists, this is the rise of historicism, is that you can't do it. You simply can't do it. All you can do is create your world from present conditions, world construction. And Gadamer, that's going to be Gadamer's greatest achievement, as he understands it, to this discussion of the so-called hermeneutical circle, or how it is that we can enter into our own tradition. The way that he's going to phrase it is that it is a fusion of horizons. So our horizon, right, that's going to be our history. How do we understand ourselves in terms of that horizon, and how do we merge it back into the horizon of our tradition, our earliest elements of tradition? And so that's going to be the aspect of this occurrence of method with respect to truth in the very title, truth and method. What Gadamer is going to flatly say here in the opening passages, and he's with respect to Kant and the notion of aesthetics, is Gadamer is going to say, I want to raise the question of truth again in a new way, right? In other words, these notions of truth by way of objectivity, subjectivity, they have become sclerotic. In other words, they're sedimented, right? They've just become ingrained in us, where we just think that this is the way. And what Gadamer is saying is we need to re-examine all of this so that we can hopefully better enter into our own tradition in a way that is defensible philosophically. And as the whole first section makes clear, that this requires that he engage with not simply Kant, but most especially with the notion of aesthetics with Kant, because it's this issue of aesthetics that has become a new category of knowing.
Mhm.
We could say that is in many respects the sum and substance of the totality of the three critiques for Kant, right? That's his understanding of reason. In fact, Kant refers to all three of his critiques as simply a critique of reason. So it's not just pure reason, it's not just practical reason, and it's not just the power of judgments, but it's reason as such. In other words, that is Kant's understanding of the man, the thinker, is the unity of all these things in terms of reason. That's what Gadamer is going to try to get people to re-examine, so that they can better understand in a philosophical way, which is to say a serious way, not just one's tradition, but the truth of that tradition, right? How do we establish truth by way of a method into it? And that's going to be for Gadamer the extent or the possibility to which we can fuse our horizon with the horizon of earlier thinkers. And only by way of that fusion are we able to navigate between both, so that we are able to learn from them, know them in a way that is true.
Yeah, and I think for many who are listening, like who come out of it, maybe like you're familiar with pastors reading the Bible too. There's other thinkers too that play into, like, you think of somebody like Spengler, who in largely argues the incommensurability of different cultural mindsets. Like Spengler goes so far as to say, like, you can't understand the Greeks at all. He says it, and he argues too that, like, even in the West, we were incapable of understanding, say, something like Christianity. Christianity had to be translated into the Western mind and made fundamentally Western. But the Christianity that we have today is not the Christianity that was in, back in the first 300, 400, 500, 600 years. It undergoes, and it has to undergo this translation, because you can only relate to the world from your own culture. Everything else is incommensurable to you. You have to bring it into your culture and make it your own. And these kind of ideas, and Spengler's not alone, these kind of ideas persist, like in a sense of it, because you see this too in missions work nowadays too, where the gospel has to be translated into the other culture. So we have to fundamentally adapt it so that the other people can understand it on their terms and not on our terms. We're not bringing. So there's that question of, like, how can you communicate the gospel at all to anybody? Like, the truth of Christ, can it be communicated to somebody who's not part of yourself? And then what's the question of, can you make converts? Can you bring somebody from the outside into your Christian society and make them Christian? Right. And is that even possible to do? Then there's also the question of, can you live separate, like the whole thing of being in the world, but not of the world? Can you live in some ways in a society and in an age and live separate from that age? And then you have the question of, interpreting the scriptures. If the scriptures really are an ancient document closed off, and this is what we've been taught, and this is how we do it, is, we've been told kind of, and we don't pick this up. We think we're actually interpreting the scriptures, but by embracing these methods, we're also often embracing the fundamental assumptions that underlie these methods. Is that the best that you can do is to create a historical reconstruction of the past. And it's then this reconstruction in the present that you then relate to, but you're not actually relating to the message that Jesus had. You're just relating to, and it's almost the kind of thing, like, it's incommensurable to you, but what you can do is a scientific reconstruction of it. And it's this reconstruction in the present that then you understand, but you're not actually understanding the scriptures.
Yeah. Right? Let me sharpen that even more. Because here you're going to see the lack of self-knowledge, or we could even say the schizophrenia of most people. They are going to flatly speak of the zeitgeist, the spirit of the time. Mm-hmm. But yet they're also going to say that many of them will say, oh yeah, I can absolutely read the Bible. Like, the notion of a zeitgeist is not problematic for me reading the Bible. But yet they'll also deploy it in other circumstances by saying, well, it was just the spirit of the times. It's like, okay, You don't understand these concepts. These are deeply philosophical concepts. The whole notion of getting back or defending one's tradition has to do with the ability to understand, and there's that Verstehen again, to understand the zeitgeist of another time with your zeitgeist. That's the whole notion of the fusion of the horizons that Gadamer is talking about. He's saying, how do we make this to where we're not cut off? Now, let's sharpen that even more. We do have a precedence for what this circumstance is, going all the way back to Plato. It's the image of the cave. What happens, right? What happens if being liberated from the chains, right, of seeing the propaganda, right? The propaganda of, we could even say the propaganda on the wall is the construction, the social construction of history given to us by these interpreters of history. What happens if being unshackled from them and dragged up to the top of the cave, there's no way out of the cave, right? And because see, that's what it means to have a historical consciousness from which you can't access other times, right? In other words, truth itself is cut off by the claim of a radical historical consciousness, right? You can't step outside of your time, right? That's going to be their claim. I mean, and people simply take that as a default given. That is also going to be another reason why academics don't really want anything to do with Gadamer anymore, because they are so thoroughly convinced that the claim of historicism, which is to say the discovery of the historical consciousness, is true, right? There's no way out of the cave. There's no exit from the cave because we are cut off by our own zeitgeist, right? We can't get out of it. We can't even understand other eras because we are so thoroughly historically conditioned by our own era. And that's going to be what Gadamer is saying. Look, not necessarily. So in other words, how do we get out of the cave, which is to say get out of our zeitgeist, our historical consciousness, so that we can navigate to an understanding of earlier eras of history that would seem, or that's the claim, that this notion of this new notion under the sun of history says that we cannot do. And I can't tell people enough how absolutely dogmatic this is claimed by everyone, especially academics. Academics will absolutely not take you seriously if you're going to say, look, I read the Bible, man. I think this is the word of God, and blah, blah, blah.
Absolutely.
Or if you're going to say, hey, look, I mean, the Greeks had something to say that we can still use for ourselves regarding virtue, and they're just going to laugh you out of the room, say, no, that's nonsense. I mean, this is everything with regard to Lacan, Foucault, Derrida. All of these people are saying that's not possible. You can't do it, man. You cannot do it. And everyone is so thoroughly postmodern that they just go along and agree, and they won't try to even engage you in discussion about it. They will just simply say, you don't know real philosophy, man. That stuff is outdated. Well, it's old news.
Like a recent example, just on Substack, Bo Weingard, Aporia magazine. I mean, he's done this a couple times now, where he says, I'd love to be able to believe, in Christianity the way that, say, like a Luther did or so forth, but we just can't do it today. The best that we can do is to accept it as a mythopoetic reality.
Yeah.
And you're like, but the problem, and this is the thing that Gadamer would say, he says, if you're accepting it as a myth, if you're saying that that's all you can do, you have no access to it at all, and it's only a mythopoetic reality, you're not actually encountering the work itself. And so, but this is, like you say, this is the only way that the intelligentsia today can relate to anything in the past, especially stuff like Christianity, the Bible, and so forth, is that the best you can do and the sophisticated way to talk about it is a mythopoetic reality. And then you come down to, if everything is cut off from you, and here's the thing, is that you really, in a sense, cannot understand yourself, because it's just sort of that radical subjectivity. You cannot turn yourself into an object to understand yourself objectively, so to speak. But at the same time, the idea is that unless you can look at something objectively, methodologically, scientifically, you don't have knowledge about it. But there is no knowledge unless you can do that. And so in this sense, then really there is only the will to power. And what happens is the will to power then gets turned into radical subjectivity, is that, in a sense, the only thing I can do is impose my own internal subjectivity onto the world. And in a sense, I'm going to be true to myself. And that, if you think about like revolutionary action in that regard and the will to power, then in terms of radical subjectivity, the will to power and the revolution as it becomes translated into radical subjectivity is transgenderism. And this is why, you think to yourself, well, why now? Why didn't it come into pass? Well, because this is the fruit of, several hundred years of philosophy, of this type of philosophical thinking working its way down into the general public of society. Is that now people believe that the only thing that they know is their own subjectivity. They can't escape anything else. And so now how I feel must be imposed on the world for it to be real. And then like the critique is to say, if you object to that, you're basically denying me being, and this is the sense, I have a right, and this is the Heideggerian aspect. I have a right to put my own subjectivity out on the horizon of time and to give it being. And you can't take that right away from me. Right. And that's in a sense this is in a sense where Heidegger can lead you. And this is what Gadamer is trying to rescue you from, to say that no, understanding is possible. There is a thing outside of yourself. You can know it. And radical subjectivity is, I guess you could get trapped up into it, but then you don't understand anything, least of all yourself.
Yeah. One thing to note that's always important about people who claim that, as so many do, that we are all so thoroughly conditioned by our own time that we can't ever truly access or know previous thinkers. That's self-reflexive. And what I mean by that is that if everything is merely a product of its time, then doesn't that would also have to apply to claiming that everything is a product of its time. And therefore, right, and so therefore, they have to admit that their fundamental claim about all time is itself radically timely.
Self-referentially incoherent.
Right. So, they have to, they themselves by their own criteria have to at least entertain that possibility, and they won't. This is the thing that I guess too, for the guys who are like the science guys, right? While you're denying, if you go down the route of say somebody like Gadamer, where you're denying that there is such a thing as truth, and it's like, no, what Gadamer's not denying such a thing as truth. He's just saying that you can't get to it the way you think you're going to get to it. And it's hard to get to. And your knowledge of it is ever only partial. And the thing is, so too, and I think he goes like, the ancients understood this. And because of Kant and everything that follows from Kant, we've lost that sense. Like if you read the scriptures, they grasp this point that truth is very, very difficult to find. And your knowledge of it is ever only partial. And when you have truth, you don't really have anything at all. And that's the thing. And then ultimately in the biblical tradition, truth flows out of the relationship with the divine, right? And unless you stand before the Lord in the fear of God, because that's where ultimately, that's how, your intuition of the divine presence is what gives you access to truth. In that regard. And the ancients understood that. Like you just read the book of say like Job or Proverbs, and as you with some sensitivity, that
the ancients understood a thing that we as moderns like really struggle to grasp.
Yeah, here's and this gets us back to a fundamental element of Gadamer's thought. This is what's going to separate him from Heidegger. Gadamer himself flatly says that, and this is in his autobiographical writings, so this is at the end of his life. He says, I want to be understood as having taken the early Heidegger and united it with the later Heidegger. So he's skipping over the so-called middle era, which is to say what Gadamer has in mind as being in time. But we can get into that. But the whole point is this. Heidegger's earliest thought, these are his 1919 lectures. This is during the emergency war semester. He's rediscovering Aristotle. And what he's found in Aristotle is an approach to truth that can be appropriated and used today, but under circumstances of radical appropriation. And then his much later thought, what Gadamer has in mind is the way that Heidegger is so emphatic about this question of language itself, but also and especially, Gadamer points out, one of the first essays that arrives of Heidegger in America, in other words, how Americans first encounter Heidegger, is some of his mid-30s writings that only get published in the 50s. These were from lectures with respect to the first of the so-called Hellsvega. This is the book that's published in English entitled Pathways, and then also subsequently Path Marks. But the very first of them, in the way that Heidegger arranges them, is an essay called The Origin of the Work of Art. And what's so important about the origin of the work of art is that Heidegger is noting that to understand art with objective thinking, in other words, the notion of object outside of oneself, and then he says that is fundamentally problematic, and it's going to define the very question of technology. Gadamer is deeply concerned. I mean, that's the whole point of his forays into science, is that the problem of technology and how objective thinking is so deeply problematic and spirals out of things. But whereas Heidegger uses a return to Aristotle, Gadamer is going to say, no, we needed to return to Plato, right? Now, what's so crucial in all of this, now I don't know that Gadamer brings this out, but what has to be understood is what I always invite people to look into is Book 7 of the Republic, right? That's where the cave comes in. The image of the cave that I sort of used as a kind of analogy for what's going on with the rise of historical self-conscious, is that Plato-Socrates provides an entire education for would-be philosophers in order to become philosopher kings. I ask people, where's the role of history in that education? Because Plato-Socrates was absolutely aware of Thucydides. He was absolutely aware of Herodotus. He was absolutely aware of Hesiod. So he knew what would otherwise be referred to as like chronological history or history as such, but it has no role in the education of the philosopher. But keep in mind also what have Glaucon and Adeimantus asked for Socrates to do for them? They're very specific. They say, Socrates, we want you to tell us about not simply justice, but we want to see its being, the being of justice, and its becoming, right? And that's that element of becoming. So the whole issue of the so-called best city in speech, which Plato-Socrates is absolutely emphatic, is not to be taken as like ever possible. I mean, he's absolutely emphatic about this throughout the entire dialogue. He says it's not something that can be founded, but the whole issue of the so-called best city in speech is itself an account of the becoming, right? The history of the being, right, of what perfect justice would be, which is to say, as exemplified by the Sidian speech, the best Sidian speech. So those things need to be taken into consideration, and that's the kind of taking seriously of Plato that Gadamer is wanting people to do again. Now,
Mm-hmm.
this is so crucial because, and Gadamer does point this out, is that everything about modernity uh, claims to be so new, right? It's almost like a literary conceit. Nothing about this topic existed prior to me, right? I mean, Kant has already said that.
Mm-hmm.
Descartes is going to say that. I
Well, and the
mean,
romantics will do it with poetry. You can't use exemplars from the past. You have to write poetry with genius. It has to be like sui generis.
and also think about what is at the core of romanticism, right? Well, it is
Mm-hmm.
a longing for getting back to an earlier time, right? But isn't that longing itself romantic, right? And in other words, the
They they
attempt to
they
get back
can't
to earlier
achieve
time.
it because to go back to earlier times, like they can't redo the epic poet because to play the old songs in the way that the epic poet did would mean that you cease to be creative and you cease to be generating that which is new. And so there is a fundamental divide between the romantic and the ancient. In a sense, he's grasping for something that's cut off from him because of his need for novelty to do what is new.
Right. And so what happens with almost all postmodern thought, in other words, what is in many respects definitive of postmodernity, certainly in its earliest stages, is the claim to a return, right? These are the so-called return movements, a return to much earlier time and making it, in other words, world construction, making it relevant for our time. That's going to be the threading of the needle between, on the one hand, the kind of vulgar understanding or the almost non-philosophical understanding of historicism, right,
Mm-hmm.
versus the postmodern notion, which is to say, yes, our historical circumstances are different, but the question is, uh, can we still return to these earlier thinkers and make them relevant for us today? So it's still a kind of world construction,
Mm-hmm.
but the question is, what gets to stay and what can't be used, right? So that's going to, and this begins, of course, with Nietzsche returning to the Greeks, most especially the pre-Socratics and Homer, and then Heidegger as well. Heidegger is going to return to primarily the pre-Socratics, and by the way, the Greek tragedians. That's going to be so new for Heidegger. And then uh, what Gadamer is going to do, and people need to understand, Gadamer was one of Heidegger's, easily by far one of his best students, is he's going to say, you know what, we don't have to go all the way back to Homer. We don't have to go back to the pre-Socratics. We don't have to go back to the Greek tragedians, although we can. But really, we need to go back and return to Plato. So contra Heidegger, who says that Aristotle understood Plato better than Plato understood himself. I mean, he's explicit about this in his Sophist lectures, and he's getting that from Kant. Kant, by the way, says that we now can know Plato better than Plato knew himself. This is in the Critique of Pure Reason. Gadamer is saying, well, how about we just return to Plato and see if we can still, what aspects of his thought we can make relevant for us.
Let's
Um,
understand Plato as Plato.
yeah, and also in the this is again where Hegel is so important for uh, Gadamer, because remember what is Hegel's fundamental project? It is to synthesize, in other words, no gap, right, no radical break between the ancients and the moderns.
Mm-hmm.
Synthesize these two things. Gadamer sees that Hegel doesn't quite do it right, but he's rather close. And Gadamer wants to correct Hegel in that possibility of synthesizing the ancients with the
Mm-hmm.
moderns, with emphasis upon Plato. So
Yeah, and it's interesting and the funny thing is that Gadamer doesn't really, he doesn't lay out like we're doing here, laying out, a whole problem. He just sort of jumps in.
Yeah.
And then he never really tells you this is what I plan to do and what I'm going to write about, but he just kind of jumps in and starts doing it. And
exactly.
so it's like
now that's crucial. That's crucial because what is God, and he's getting this from Heidegger, by the way. Whenever you read an essay by Heidegger, he doesn't just give you a thesis and then defend it. No. He actually takes you through the steps of the philosophy that gets you to the ending. This is exactly what Gadamer is doing. Gadamer spends so much time with the history of the thinkers prior to him because he's taking you, the reader, step by step through his thought process, which is to say, the doing of philosophy to arrive at what he's going to refer to as those fusions of horizons. Right?
So what he'll begin doing is, as you open it up, he'll lay out basically the problem like the first 8 or 9 pages, right? So you get to, and if it goes by pretty quick, right? So that would be page 8 on the revised second edition, right? So he talks about, but the picture that Helmholtz gives of the work in the natural sciences is rather one-sided, seeing that he does not believe in quote unquote sudden flashes of intuition, or in so-called inspirations, and regards scientific work as the self-conscious work of drawing ironclad conclusions. He refers to John Mill's view that in modern times, the inductive sciences have done more to advance the methods of logic than all the professional philosophers. They are for him the model of scientific method as such. And that, that as such is always an important philosophical term, especially in post-Kantian work. So that's the equivalent of the Socratic in itself. So in itself, right? That's right. So inductive science is knowledge as such. And the idea of intuition or inspiration is completely set aside, right? And so then from there, Gadamer is now going to begin to look at the philosophical tradition, and he's going to begin picking up pieces, fragments, and drawing your attention to them as you go forward. He'll discuss a word here, a word there, and then he'll pull the thing because he's looking to give you all of the building blocks now and to recover this idea of intuition. It's really interesting that when you look at this notion of intuition and inspiration, that somebody like, say, Thomas Kuhn in the Philosophy of Science, and this would be, of course, after Gadamer, but Thomas Kuhn made the argument that no discoveries are made inductively. He says they're all intuitive. And he says, then if you look at the actual practice of science, he says the vast majority, almost the totality of all discovery is made through intuition. And then the inductive method is the means by which you demonstrate to the world that you're right. So it's in a sense you're coming through. But he says that fundamentally, Thomas Kuhn fundamentally argued that every scientific discovery is a leap of intuition. And then the rest of your task is then set upon you to prove that your intuition is correct using the inductive method. But you're not actually learning anything inductively. And it's a fundamental reversal of process. And Gadamer is, in a sense, doing something similar philosophically in making the argument that, in fact, it is not induction that gives you knowledge and truth, because that's truth and method. It's not induction, it's not method that gives you truth, it's rather intuition. And now so you're on page 9 and you've got 600 pages to go, where he will now lay out for you that intuition, inspiration, the sudden flash of intuition is actually the heart of truth. That you just simply know something and you know with sureness that this is true.
Yeah, and that takes us back to the significance, not simply of Plato, but also of Aristotle. This is the role of nous.
Yeah.
What nous is these flashes of insight, and then once you have the perceptual flash of insight, then you attempt to give a logos of it, right? And that's also, by the way, why a large part of why Gadamer is returning to Plato. This is absolutely the issue of the so-called divided line in Book 6 of Plato's Republic that leads up to the image of the cave. And Plato Socrates flatly says, now take that image, in other words, the divided line, and add it to this image of the cave. So we have to do those things. But one thing, just to again point out why it is that Gadamer is so helpful for us. That person Helmholtz, most people don't know who Helmholtz is. Well, Helmholtz is so absolutely crucial because, and this is what Gadamer has in mind when he's bringing up Helmholtz and the notion of how he institutionalizes, literally, this empirical method. Helmholtz was the leading figure by far that established the modern research institution that gets founded with the University of Berlin, roughly 1810. That university, that model of the university, defines our world because it took over the world. Every other country adopted the model of the University of Berlin, which is to say Helmholtz's vision for what the university should accomplish, which is to say, and this is crucial, new additional knowledge. So prior to the University of Berlin and prior to Helmholtz, the whole purpose of the university was to keep alive and to educate its students in the so-called liberal arts, right? That was wisdom. In other words, our best predecessors. With Helmholtz, he's saying, no, look, we now have this new thing, modern science, okay? It advances knowledge, right? And also now think of Francis Bacon, the advancement of learning, right? And all these things are coming together. This is why Kant, by the way, uses a line from Francis Bacon as an epitaph, right? Well, an epigraph to the first critique of pure reason, right? In other words, look, we have new knowledge now. And so the whole purpose of the modern university is to not safeguard all of the traditional, right? There's tradition, the traditional wellspring of knowledge. No, that's not what the purpose is anymore. The purpose of the university now is to advance knowledge, to keep going, to find new things. Now, ultimately, this is fundamentally going to not just involve, but absolutely require none other than the denial of biblical miracles. I mean, that should blow people's hair off. Like, whoa, wait a minute. You're telling me that the modern research institution, all of our institutions, are grounded most fundamentally on one principle, which is the denial of miracles. Yes.
Yeah. And then,
That's
exactly. And then you get into like Schmidt's political theology, which is also built on the question of the miracle. I was just going to say, Athenian, before we go much farther, because we're only like 9 pages into Gadamer, did we want to take a short like bathroom break and then come back and we can dive into some of these words and concepts and give the people a little bit more in the works, and we can do that. I don't know what your time is like this morning yet.
Well, I've got a client in about 15 or 20 minutes, so this might actually be a good place for us to wrap it up. And so let me emphasize to your listeners. See, I forced this on Kryptos because Kryptos was like, "Look, man, let's just go, let's just dive in," and I was the one who said, I said, okay, but hold on, we have to make the listeners aware of why we think this is a book worthy of diving into. So
there we go.
I hope that all the listeners are now sufficiently primed for why taking Gadamer seriously is so crucial. And so now, with going forward, now we're going to do this sort of deep dive, beginning to end, of Gadamer's truth and method. So,
and then we'll go through, and this will give the reader, time to order the book if they so choose, and catch up on the reading, so to speak.
Yeah.
Anyways, Athenian, well then, if you've got a client that you need to head off to, we'll wrap up here, and then I'll message you and we'll set a date for the next one, and then we'll announce when the next one is. And I think this was a great discussion, I think, and it really did frame the importance of Gadamer, and sort of lays the foundation of where we're going to go, because next, the first word that he dives right into is the word Bildung, culture.
Right.
And there we go. So anyways,
let me just add
sure.
this one last note for the listeners. Always, always, always keep in mind the title that Gadamer gives to the work, Truth and Method. In other words, it's not truth in method. What Gadamer is saying is that's where everyone already is. They think that truth has already been found in method. And what Gadamer is saying is, with the title of the book, he's saying, hold on a second. How about we think about truth and this other thing called method? And then, as Gadamer is going to explicitly say in some of the opening pages, is that only then can we raise the question of truth in a new way, right? So what everyone just assumes is that truth is found in method. Well, what is that method? Well, it's objectivity, it's science, it's Helmholtz. Helmholtz is university, right? And what Gadamer is saying is we need to find a way to sort of break away from that, to even begin to question it, to say, okay, there's probably some truth there, but let's get back to some more fundamentals, right? And the fundamentals are examining what even is this thing we understand as method, and how is it to be situated with respect to our desire to seek truth, right? That's going to be the key to everything.
That's very good. Yeah. All righty. Well, with that, hopefully the listeners are ready and excited for the next installment, now that we've set up the groundwork. Anyways, you take care, Athenian, and I'm looking forward to the next discussion on this, and this will give us a chance to get further into the work and lay out the concepts and what we want to talk about next.
Definitely. Thank you so much for this. This is going to be great.
You're welcome.